Hello, and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 133. Should we pay student teachers? With Dr. Tina Beveridge. Is student teaching a class or a job? Does this practice need a revamp in the face of the current teacher shortage? In this episode, I invited Tina Beveridge to hash out a disagreement. A few months ago, I created a TikTok expressing my opinion that student teachers don't deserve a paycheck, mostly based on the idea that student teaching is a class and a crucial final course in the training of teachers. That TikTok video is linked in the show notes. Turning it into a job could potentially create a perverse incentive structure for entering the profession. Dr. Beveridge disagrees and saw my TikTok and responded with this blog that is also linked in the show notes. One of the things she said in the blog was, first, the internship is not a class. Yes, it's credits. They have to register for it. It has credits. They have to register and pay for. And in that respect, it's a class, but it's not a class in the respect that we expect them to go in knowing nothing. In fact, we expect them to go in and actually be able to do the full job. So in keeping with the spirit and ethos of this show, I invited Tina on to discuss because a conversation is much more productive than social media posts back and forth. The resulting conversation is proof of that. We found a lot of common ground and had a lively and laughter-filled argument. When the episode is done, please weigh in your thoughts in the comments wherever you see this post. Of course, you can also jump on over to the Choralosophers Facebook page. I'm sure there will be a lively conversation happening over there. Are you hankering to have a professional quality ensemble singing experience in the summer, but you're too busy during the school year to be in part of a professional choir? Well, I lead one in the summer. Every single year at the Contorai Summer Choral Institute. Enrollment is now open until May of 2023 for the June 21st through 25th Choral Scholars Experience at Contorai Summer Choral Institute. So head over to ContouraiKC.com. The link will be in the show notes. And you can get signed up to sing with me. It's going to be an awesome time and an incredible ensemble. SightReadingFactory.com is the best literacy tool on the market. I will die on that hill. If you don't have it yet for your classroom, get it now. Sight Reading Factory memberships are only $35 a month, plus you can get a 10% discount when you enter Choralosophy at checkout. It gets even more value for you if you get all those memberships for your students. You can knock 10% off of all of that by entering Choralosophy at checkout. And make sure you do that Choralosophy checkout code every single year when you renew your membership. Have you been listening to this show regularly for a while now, but still have not joined the Patreon? It's time. Patreon.com/Choralosophy. Chip in $3 a month. It's the cost of a coffee. And the recurring little bits of income from each of you, the awesome group of supporters over there, are really keeping this show alive. That underwrites all my costs so that I don't have to dip into my own personal family pocket to make this show and to keep the content and professional development coming to you at a high level of quality. Plus, there's lots of really fun goodies there for the supporters at Patreon. The producers are Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrike Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kikachik. Okay, everybody, I'm here with Tina Beveridge, and we're going to be discussing and bantering some ideas back and forth about education reform, specifically how do we deal with student teachers? How do we deal with the teacher shortage? What are some of the things that might be contributing to that? And I'm really excited to bat some ideas around. So Tina, welcome.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
So first, let's get to know you. Who are you? Where are you? What do you do every day?
So my name is, as you said, I'm Tina Beveridge. I'm a professor of music education at George Mason University in Virginia. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say this is my opinions and not the opinions of my employer or whatever, but I'm going to throw that in there.
You go right ahead.
Yeah. So just in case, cover my bases. Before I got to Mason, I was a doctoral student at the University of Miami. So I have been on the East Coast now for almost 4 years, but I'm originally from Oregon and spent the majority of my career teaching K-12 music in Washington State. So I've mostly been on the West Coast with a short stint in the Chicago area when I went to Northwestern for my master's program, and that's basically me. I teach all levels of music. I've done 5 years of band and 10 years of choir and 6 years of elementary. I've done basically everything except orchestra at this point,
Uh-huh.
which is sort of how I got into the higher ed circle, because one of my colleagues in Washington State, I'm going to have to keep saying state
Right.
versus
Right.
DC, right? Um, and one of my colleagues said, "Wow, you've taught a lot of different kinds of classes. You would make a really good music ed professor." And at the time, I had no desire to do any of that because, as we'll talk about in a little bit when we talk about teacher pay, higher ed pay, that's a whole podcast in itself.
I bet. I bet.
um, it's not. It is. Yeah, yeah. We'll get into. Might get into that later, but it's a thing. And so I wasn't really
Yeah.
interested in it at the time, but I like researching too. I like writing, and when you're a K-12 teacher, you don't really have a whole lot of extra time to do that because the task of teaching and all the tasks around that take up so much time, that like doing a research project, you simply don't have the time to do it. So I ended up doing that, and here I am.
Hmm.
And now I get to talk to fabulous people like you. So
Awesome. That's
it's
great.
it's a pretty
So
good gig.
yeah, that sounds awesome. I think I'll just catch the audience up on where this conversation is coming from, and also I'll tell the little
Right.
story about how you and I
Sure.
started planning this conversation. I posted a video to my TikTok about student teachers. I was having a conversation with a guy who was making the argument that student teachers should be paid. I don't think they should. And so I was making that argument back, and then I saw on Facebook that you had written a blog about that topic, and so I have that here in front of me. We can go through some of the points, but basically, there we have a difference of opinion about how this should work out. But I think there's probably some common ground on what a perfect world would look like for some of these things, and so like and how does the internship period of a student teacher's life possibly create barriers for people entering the profession, because now I've got to get no job for however many months or whatever. So let's kind of start there. I'll start with kind of the premise of my reasoning for that I don't think they should get paid, and I just wanted you to kind of respond to that and give your thoughts,
Sure.
and that way we can catch everybody up on where you and I have already been. So my
Especially
thought.
for people who aren't on TikTok and all that.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct. And in the show notes of this episode, I'll post some links to things people can catch
Okay.
up to. But
Cool.
so my thought is that student teachers are finishing probably the most important part of their education when they student teach. And it's the final piece. It's a crucial piece, which is that they need to leave the abstract world of an undergraduate training program and enter an actual real world classroom with human children, while
Hmm.
not being ready to be alone yet. Which means
Right.
that they then have a mentor teacher who is going to be doing. In my experience, I've supervised several, like a dozen student teachers in my life, and oftentimes when they come to my classroom, I'm doing the work of teaching my class, but I'm also doing the work of teaching them how to teach. So I'm doing like extra work, right? And so
Hmm.
to me, it didn't seem like, while I understand the idea that it's a hardship to not have a job for that amount of time, I was struggling to deal with how they would get paid, because if they applied, they wouldn't get the job. And then I
Hmm.
also struggle with who would pay them. So would it be the school district, or would it be the university, or would it be the state, or whatever else it is? So
Yeah.
my general argument is that they shouldn't get paid kind of on a because they haven't earned it yet
Hmm.
perspective. And that's kind of the big picture, but we'll zoom into the details. So now, what's your big picture on this topic?
Um, so my big picture on this topic has to do with there are, and this is where I think we're going to find the common ground, is that there are some massive systemic issues that undergird this whole conversation. For example, teachers in general just don't get paid enough for what they do. I don't think there's anybody who would argue necessarily against that, except for the people who are in charge of giving the pay raises.
Right.
And so right off the bat, there's that problem, right? But and in concert with that problem, you have that we are asking them to take on extra work, because it is extra work to take on a student teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who are in teacher education, like in charge of those programs, are really aware of who we place the student teachers with, what is their workload like, can we ask them to do it multiple years in a row, what kind of compensation can we give them? And usually it's not much, and that's not really in our control to give them more compensation. In my perfect world, mentor teachers would be getting paid a huge stipend to take on these student teachers, because it is extra work to go over their lesson plans with them and do the feedback and all the conversations that have to happen when you're doing the mentorship thing right. And so right off the bat, it's not that I don't think the mentor teachers, like, I understand that the mentor teachers are doing an extra amount of work, because that was, I know, one of your main points, and I completely agree with that. But another one of your points is, where does that money come from, right? So does the university pay the student teachers? Because we don't, as a university, I'm not actually, because I'm new to Mason, I don't actually know what the policy is for mentor teachers and their compensation yet. But I know that there's a lot of universities will offer a small stipend of several $100s, which doesn't even remotely come close to the hours that they put in. A lot of places will offer credits through their university, which I have mixed feelings about, because as a K-12 teacher, that was awesome, because then I take care of my professional development just by taking on a student teacher. My license renewal happens automatically, no big deal. But at the same time, credits only cost a university money when they have a professor that they're paying or an instructor that they're paying and overhead. The credits themselves don't cost the university anything. There's no overhead to that when they're just handing them out. So it feels a little tokenistic to me. I don't personally think that's a great way to handle it, but at the same time, I see the K-12 teachers going, but it's easy to renew my license.
Right.
So,
there's lots of those little games in the system. My school district, and some of the games are to the teacher's benefit, like in that situation, and some of the games are not to our benefit. Like, for example, I'll just give you one of the benefits that I'm not complaining about is that in my district we partner with a local university for professional development, and we can get our post-grad credits through a local university, nice. And then we get pay raises from that, and so our school district pays part of that tuition, and then we pay the other part. And it's great, but these are like classes that are stupid easy. Like, I took 4 credits in Bitmoji. Seriously, and I contributed that towards my pay raise, and I took Bitmoji 1 and Bitmoji 2. So if anybody needs to know how to make a Bitmoji, I can help them with postgraduate credit to my credentials.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's great.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, we had in Washington State, different nonprofits could apply to be what we call clock hours. I don't know what they call it here yet, but we called them clock hours, and 10 clock hours was equivalent in the pay scale to 1 college credit. So we had nonprofits all over the state, Washington Music Educators Association, and there were ensembles, community ensembles, where if you're a teacher, you could play in these ensembles and you could earn your clock hours by playing in a group. And I mean, as a musician, that's awesome. I thought that was a great way, because we could learn from each other too and keep our musician skills. Like, I kind of love that. But at the same time, it's like, I would probably be doing this anyway.
Right.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But it's an easy way to keep the licensure process moving, I guess.
Don't forget you can enter Choralosophy at checkout to get a discount on sheet music when you go to ryanmain.com, who's just got incredible stuff on his website, especially if you teach those middle school and high school age singers like I do. You can also go to graphitepublishing.com and search their growing stable of composers there, and search in their awesome web search feature and find exactly the piece that you want, download it and print it today. Even better, you can enter Choralosophy at checkout and save 10%. Well, if you need the top-of-the-line choral folders labeled with gold embossed print and all of that fun stuff, I do that for my all-staters every year. But if you need a set for your choir, I would head over to mymusicfolders.com and also enter Choralosophy at checkout to save 5%. Yeah, now, so in kind of bringing us back to the student teachers, I want to kind of zoom into
Yeah,
some of the
sorry.
things. No, don't be sorry. I got off topic too. The audience is used to it. So I want to zoom into one of the points in your blog, because I highlighted
Okay.
a couple. I highlighted a couple of things. First of all, I also have to give you a shout out that you still operate a blog spot, because that is so retro, and like I just love that it's a blog spot.
It's because I've had it. I'm sure you saw. I've had
Uh-huh.
it for like 15 years or something, and I just recently brought it back as just a place to write and
Uh-huh.
get thoughts out. Because when I took philosophy in my doctoral program, we had to do blog posts, and I was like, this is a good place to do like a rough draft before I turn it in on Blackboard, because
Yeah.
I couldn't edit in Blackboard for some reason. It was weird. But anyway, so it's
Yeah.
just that's the one I have.
That's great. That's great. So I'll post a link when I'm done with this, so people can see the whole thing. But the
Okay.
first part I highlighted is that you and I have a disagreement about whether or not we should think of student teaching as a class, right? So
Mhm.
I had made the argument in my TikTok video that the students are paying. They shouldn't be paid because they're paying tuition in the same way that we wouldn't pay
Mhm.
them to take algebra. We wouldn't pay them to take their history course. Um,
Right.
and I would, you could disagree with that. I would say that's a good thing. We shouldn't be paying. It really screws up the incentives when you pay people to do things that they would not have otherwise done. And
Mhm.
there's all kinds of downstream effects that are negative to that. My argument is that it's a class because they are learning, maybe not from a university professor, but they're learning in a real world setting, just like they would if they were taking a class to go
Mhm.
into like a mechanic shop and learn, auto engineering. There are universities that do that too. There's internship situations in lots of programs. And you said in the blog that the internship is not a class, and that credits have to register. You have to register and pay for the credits. In that respect, it is a class, but it's not a class in the respect that we expect them to go in knowing nothing. And here's where I wanted to suss out some of those details, because I don't
Sure.
think I agree with that, because I don't think that we go into student teaching, we don't let them go into student teaching knowing nothing. It's kind of the culmination of their music education training at that point. I think of it as that crucial final course where they have to
Mhm.
test what they've learned against reality under the supervision of someone who's been there and done it. And so that's why I
Right.
think of it as a class. It's a different type of class, but I do think of it as a class in that very crucial educational aspect. How would you respond to that?
Um, so my so going back to the perfect world scenario,
Hmm.
I would, in a perfect world, set up student teaching so that they are in this scenario as a class, but then spend their entire first year teaching like a residency, like a medical residency, where they're getting paid
Okay.
for the first year, but still with a mentor who checks in with them all the time.
Hmm.
Maybe not in the same room with them, um, but reality is that we don't have that. And so because of that reality, we do not set up student teaching for them to it's not set up on the university side for them to be learning from the mentor teacher, even though we know that's going on. We are setting them up. Their goal in that placement is to be teaching a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however long, they're supposed to build up depending on how long the placement is, to basically doing the job alone.
Right.
That's what they're supposed to be
Okay,
doing.
but let's talk about that
And
though for a second.
so, okay.
Can we talk? Because I don't think that actually ever happens. Now, in other subjects, it might, but I don't know any choir teacher that I've ever met in 20 years that has a student teacher come in for, like, say, the spring and just lets the student teacher teach all their choirs. Like, and they just sit there drinking coffee. Like, I've never ever heard of that ever. But if you know that that happens, then tell us about that.
Well, I do know that it happens because it's a requirement in most states
Ah,
now. It
then
it's yeah,
I would
for
never take a
licensure
student
they
teacher again. I would never
yeah,
take a student teacher
yeah.
again.
For example, now how that looks can be different for each mentor teacher,
Uh-huh.
how they organize that. But like in Virginia, they have to have 300 hours of independent teaching. So
Okay.
they have to be able to do that independently, just like they would if they were a medical resident just getting checked in with. So I feel like the difference here is that in my perfect world, we wouldn't be pushing them into that. It would be a class where we're checking in and doing all the homework and the assessments and stuff. And we do the assessments, but it's by the time you get to student teaching, if there's massive problems with what they're doing, they shouldn't they shouldn't be graduating. They shouldn't be entering the teaching profession. There's,
Right.
if you can't show up, if you can't come to work on time, this might not be the job for you. And
And I've had one of
you
those.
know,
I've had those.
I
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
And I know lots of people who have.
So, okay, so this is good because this is why I'm glad we're having this conversation because we've already kind of dug up one of the roots of why we have this disagreement is because what I think
Mhm,
of as student teaching in a choral classroom is very different than what you're
mhm.
describing.
Right.
When a student teacher, and maybe it's a state thing, I don't know, I'm in Missouri, and when a student teacher comes to be with me for 10 weeks or whatever it is, I am teaching the class every day,
Mhm,
all the time. And because the choral classroom, of course, is different than a math class or you know, a history class, independent teaching, I could still find opportunities to give that student teacher independent teaching time, but they're not going to be in
mhm.
charge of the preparation of choirs leading up to our contest in the spring, for example. Like they're not ready for that, and I would never push that off onto a student teacher because the students deserve an expert in the room providing that experience for them. So what I would
Yeah.
do is I would give the student teacher would do a lot of observing. They would do a lot of
Mhm,
co-teaching because we have a system where multiple teachers could be teaching. They might go out
uh-huh,
into a practice room to lead a sectional.
uh-huh.
They might go into a practice room to help a small ensemble prepare their adjudication piece, for example. So I can still
Right.
give them tons of stuff to do, but they're
Mhm.
not going to be doing things that I would normally do, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
just because it wouldn't be practical in our world for them to do that. But it sounds like maybe
So,
that some places do it differently.
yeah, I guess my question to you then would be, why not? How are they going to learn how to prepare students for a festival if they've never done it?
They're gonna watch me because I'm freaking good at it. That's what they're gonna do, and they're gonna have the privilege of being in my classroom to watch a functioning program, and they're going to understand. They're gonna have opportunities to teach and conduct. But here's the thing, though. So the big why not it comes back to even if I have a student teacher in the room in the building
Mhm,
for that 10 weeks, they are
mhm,
my second priority to the needs of my students. They are not going to be the top priority under any circumstances. If they aren't cutting it, they're not going to stand in front of my choir. If they're not showing up on time, they're going to be treated that way. Now I have and
mhm,
it varies, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying before. It varies. I've had some student teachers who are ready to do that, but that's really
mhm.
rare. And I've had, probably, like I said, I've had 12. I've had probably two or three that were actually ready by the end of undergrad to stand in front of a choir of 100 kids who can sight read better than most college undergrads can and actually and actually lead a rehearsal. So the why
Mm,
not is that they're not ready. And I've had student teachers walk out of classrooms of my classroom crying because they were so not ready. And so ultimately, I think that's why the my perspective is what it is that
mhm.
they are still cutting their teeth when they get to me, and I think it's as it should be because they aren't of course this varies by program too, right? So like
Right,
there are school music programs that operate on a very low musical level. Let's just be honest, there are. And there would be undergrads that would be ready to come in and step those programs up, and then there are some that are not. So I guess that's
right.
a long answer to your why not, but why not would be because I don't want it wouldn't be what's best for the student teacher, but it wouldn't be what's best for my students either.
Right. And I so that brings me to a little side story about my own student teaching.
Hmm.
Because a lot of the things that I experienced in for my first placement. So I went to a school that had quarters. So I did 10 weeks in high school and 10 weeks in elementary.
Hmm.
Um, I'm learning. I have some real strong opinions about uh, semester schools because I know that's the majority of them, and doing 7-week placements in each place. Yeah, in 7 weeks, there's not a lot of time to do that. But because I had 10 weeks, like the first day he had me work, my mentor teacher, my first day he had me working with his piano class,
Hmm.
you know? And then by the end of the semester, well, not even by the end of the semester. So it was, let me see, end of January. It was sometime around, there was an event that he had to go to, and it was one of those things where like there was a sub in the room, but I was the one running the classes,
Hmm.
kind of deal. And he was gone for like 3 days. I was alone with those kids teaching. Well, not alone, the sub was there, but the sub wasn't a music person, so that doesn't it's not really helpful. They're helpful in, if somebody's bleeding, but they weren't helping me teach. I was in charge of those classes for 3 days by myself.
Right.
And I am a better teacher. I was a better teacher. I was more successful in my first year because I was working in a similar school to that. The program wasn't as big or as strong, but I was better prepared for that because I had that independent teaching time.
Yeah.
And so I feel very strongly that these requirements that the states have are really important you because I feel like I'm old enough. I don't know how old you are, but like I remember some of my friends going through student teaching where the teacher would be like, peace out, and they would go sit in their office and answer emails or whatever, and the student teacher was just like, and then you have
Yep.
the opposite problem where they're not prepared because nobody's there guiding them when they screw up.
Yes. I've seen that too.
So
I've seen that too.
right,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yep.
So going back to the whether we should pay them or not,
Hmm.
isn't maybe I wrote it differently in the blog because I was just like mind barfing a little bit.
Right.
but
Right.
um but whether or not it's considered a class isn't really the point for me
Okay.
for them getting paid.
Hmm.
Cuz the point of them getting paid is so that they aren't working second jobs when they leave. Because the reality is that most of them do. I did.
Oh yeah, I did too.
I would leave my student teaching assignment and go work at a restaurant for until midnight and then get up at 5 in the morning again to go teach jazz choir or whatever. And it was miserable. And there are so many things that I could have had more time to reflect on, more time to improve, more time to practice if I wasn't working after school. And
Hmm.
my husband even had to work during his first month of his first job because you don't get paid until the first month of or the first day of October or whatever, or the first paycheck. He
Right.
had to work 2 jobs his whole first month. Nobody should have to do that. If we actually want them to get good at it and we don't want to burn them out before they've even started, we have to start with fixing that problem. And so paying them creates an avenue for people who don't have the resources to live with their parents or take loans or whatever, because your tuition money doesn't pay your rent,
Yeah. No,
you
absolutely.
know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are probably my resistance to that is not because I disagree with any of those things. I think it's it's the message that it sends. If and maybe it's just a verbiage thing. Like for example, I was talking about my wife or with my wife about this topic before we came on, just because I like to tell her what I'm about to go talk about, and and she was talking about how like, well, what if rather than getting paid, if we use that word, like paid makes me think it's a job, and if I think if it's a job, then I'm not in a class anymore. And if I'm taking a job, or if I have a job, then I'm thinking of myself as a professional rather than as a student. And maybe they're not quite ready to be professionals. So maybe if we change the verbiage, it's that it's a scholarship,
Mhm,
a living expenses stipend that comes with rules. And like, it's like
mhm,
kind of like a scholarship. You've got to meet certain criteria to get the money. And it's more than just showing up at the student teaching. You have to do the due diligence, and it's going to have to
mhm.
go towards it's got to go towards your rent and groceries or whatever it is. It can't be to go to Cancun for spring break and all those
Right.
types of things. And it's that, but and maybe if schools had that, or if states had that, none of us, like,
Mhm.
I would not have an issue with that at all. I think my
Right.
issue is comes in if we start to make these kind of like moralistic student teachers deserve to be paid, and because they deserve it, they should get it. And that's where I come back, like come away from it, is
Yeah.
like, because there's that we have to earn stuff, you know.
Yeah. No, that completely makes that. I don't disagree with you about that. The way in which, and I think this is an issue with the way things get presented on social media, is
Hmm.
it's always it's always a zero sum game. It's always a moralistic argument. It's a black and white. You're either for or against, and we know that in real life there's more nuance than that, right?
Hmm.
So what's really I looked it up because I know this exists. They just passed it. That we're going to get to see this experiment in real time.
Hmm.
The state of Michigan passed this. I can't remember if they passed it before they changed legislatures or if they just passed it with the new legislature. I forget, but they passed it. And the stipend, I think they called it a stipend. I looked it up earlier today and I've already forgotten. So, and I won't pause to
Yeah.
look it up
Right.
again. But you could put a link in there, in your links to so people can read it for themselves. I think they called it a stipend, and there was a whole list of requirements. You have to be enrolled at an accredited institution, and you have to be like there was a whole list of things. And we're going to get to see, I would hope, that what this will do for the state of Michigan is it's going to expand their teacher pool to people who would have never thought to be teachers before because of the money issue,
Hmm.
because the money, especially during that internship period, is such an obstacle for so many people. And if the goal actually is to diversify the workforce, we have to make those things accessible for a more diverse pool of people
Hmm.
than than me.
Hmm.
you know because I represent the majority of teachers, right? I'm a middle-aged white woman. that's
Yeah. Well,
that's the majority.
and yes, there's the white part. There's the white part, but there's also the middle age part, because and this, we
Hmm.
should probably touch on this, because it's also middle age teachers of color are actually more, we're de-diversifying in a lot of situations
Hmm.
because of the money aspect. And so I don't disagree with you there. It's in my generation, my undergrad was $5,000 a semester, because I'm 43
Hmm.
years old, and I went to school in the 90s and early 2000s, and I went in state.
Yep.
And so I don't have student loans. Like, I was able to work a job and pay my tuition as I went. And that's a privilege,
Yeah,
that's an age generation privilege, that
for sure.
has nothing to do with me being white, and it has,
Right.
but it does make And this is where the nuance of social media, or the lack of nuance on social media, comes, it makes it hard too, because I can understand why a person 20 years younger than me might have a different opinion about this, because when I was reaching my student teaching,
Mhm.
I wasn't staring down the barrel of $50,000 in debt. I could take a semester off of working as many hours as I was working, barrel down and eat ramen noodles for 3 months
Mhm.
and get through student teaching, and it wasn't that big of a deal because I didn't owe the state of Missouri a whole bunch of money for tuition, or the
Right.
federal government, I guess, in our case. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes sense. The reason I brought up the brought white part, the
Hmm.
reason I brought that into it is because there was I don't know if you probably are. I don't know if the people listening are familiar with the demographic studies on who takes high school music by Ken Elpis and Carlos Abril.
Not specifically,
But
no.
in Yeah, I'll send you that link so you can put that on there too. They're really, really good national representative, let's see if I can say the word, studies of who enrolls in high school music. And they did one in 2011 and one in 2019. And in the 2019 study, they talked about a kind of a weird thing in the data where like every demographic of student uh, increased their enrollment in music as their academic achievement went up, except for African American students, who, as their academic achievement went up, the likelihood of their enrollment in music went down, which they didn't necessarily offer any explanations or cause or whatever. But it's something to think about, that we're also not enrolling high achieving African American students in music programs for music education either. And that, so then you're just like, you're going backwards in the recruiting. Well, first we don't have a diverse enough teaching population, which affects the students. And then you go back and you go, but who are we recruiting in the colleges? And then who are we recruiting from the high schools? And it just goes back to, it's like I said, a lot of these things are systemic.
Yep.
And as I'm sure, you know, because it the proportion of uh, the proportion of racially minoritized students living in poverty is higher than it is for white people.
Yep.
So it's
You
just
just talked. Yeah.
a
The last.
reality of,
Yeah. No, you're exactly right.
yeah.
The last 25 minutes of the last episode that the audience will have just heard is about that.
Yeah.
In
So,
detail, and where some of those averages can cause us to have misleading conclusions. And
mhm,
this is where this is
yeah.
a really good point, because in my community, and I won't rehash the last week's episode, but in my community, it's mostly middle class and upper middle class black families. If there are black families, because
Mhm.
it's in my community, because it's suburban, and
Right.
and they're families that have moved out of the city, and maybe first or second generation moved out of the city, and so and it's so I'll also just throw a tag in there that another place that audience can go to hear more about this, and maybe if you didn't catch it, is my very first episode with my friend Maria Ellis. We talk about this.
Oh, yeah.
This conversation goes really into depth about why it's hard for us to get some black kids, high achieving black kids, to do music, and
Mhm.
even if we lay down at their feet and beg them. So
Yeah.
so that
Yeah.
I'll link that, and I'll send that to you afterwards, because that
Yeah.
not being the topic of our conversation here, but you're exactly right.
Right. But
All of these things intersect. You know.
yeah, absolutely. And the and I was also talking to my spouse this afternoon
Hmm.
about this podcast too, is that we were having a completely separate conversation about the tendency for low paying jobs to be overpopulated by women, and service sector jobs and that sort of thing too.
Hmm.
And I think if we are also looking to recruit men into education, that some of these monetary things also need, I mean, like they
Yeah.
need to be fixed for everybody, but that might help us recruit that demographic, which we continue to say is important for, representation for the students, for their learning. It's We all learn better from diverse populations. I like to compare education, like diversity in education, to a forest. So, because I grew up in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
So in Oregon, we had, when I was growing up, the big issue was the ecosystem and logging and clear cutting, and they put restrictions on it because of the spotted owl, and it was a whole thing. And what we learned as they started replanting some of these clear cut areas is that when they planted them with all one kind of tree to harvest later, the forests weren't growing the way they were supposed to,
Mm-hmm.
because you didn't have the complementary species that were helping each other grow. And then you didn't have the wildlife that was underneath it and the plants that grow underneath it, and they're supposed to be there, to make it an actual healthy forest.
It's
So
called biodiversity.
correct.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
and farmers know this.
Yep.
They have to rotate their crops. They have to, it's this it shouldn't be so it shouldn't be so hard for us to figure this out in education, but we put these barriers up like money and then wonder why we don't have, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and the barriers can come in lots of different forms. Money is just one of them,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think
So,
so. This is my hot take on this, which is that one of the reasons we struggle to figure this out in education is because we are really stuck on these single variable solutions and causes of the problem. In other words, we say,
mhm,
well, it's money, or no, it's racism,
right,
or maybe my hot take is that it's some of those things, but it's also way more complicated than we could possibly imagine. There's also cultural things. There's also
mhm,
barriers to communication. There's also just the idea, for example, if you're talking about black families like that live in my community that have,
mhm,
like, maybe mom or grandma busted her ass to sell their house in the inner city so that they could move out to the suburbs to get their kid a better education. And I'll be damned if
right,
I'm going to let my kid waste their time in a choir class because
right,
I didn't give up all that to have them, not be a doctor. My kid's going to be a doctor, right?
yep. And we
That's the barrier
absolutely
I
see
see.
this thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I actually, I have a former student from Miami who comes from, her family's from India, I think. And that's a huge thing, that for families, especially families that come from impoverished countries, India is
Hmm.
just the one example, but
Yeah.
where the families go, I'll be damned if I'm going to let you major in something that you're going to end up living in poverty again.
Yep. Yep. And you can
Like
understand.
I will be perfect. Yeah.
I was just going to say
Sorry.
you can
Go ahead.
no, you're good. You can understand why the parents or the grandparents think that. At the same time,
Absolutely.
you feel bad for the kid because they're trying to follow their dreams, and they're also being told that the American dream is to grow up and be whatever it is that you want to be, and you've got this kid who wants to be a musician, and mom and grandma are saying no. And then
Hmm.
on the flip side of that, then we've got choirs that are just whiter than, the wind-driven snow. And so there's all these different aspects that play into it.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's racial bias, sometimes it's poverty, sometimes it's these cultural
Yep.
aspects. It's
Absolutely.
this rich tapestry of problems. In fact,
Right.
one of the problems, and I want to, if it's okay, if you, I'm going to go back into your blog
Okay.
because this kind of makes me think of one of these other potential problems. There's a paragraph that you wrote in here about the perception of the students of this generation being even like just whiny or entitled or whatever. And I want to read a
Yeah.
little bit about what you wrote, and then we'll
Sure.
kind of dive into it. So there is this perception that this current generation of student teachers or students in general are more entitled than previous generations, and you called it old people nonsense, which I think is hilarious. I do think there are some major differences in how younger people interact with others because of the prevalence of technology that makes them appear self-involved, but the awareness that makes them anxious comes from that same technology. So there's an awareness of what's going on around them in the world. Now, this is again
An
the great.
awareness that I would argue you and I never had. And maybe we did, but not at the same level that they do, because we simply just didn't have the same access to the information constantly all the time.
Right.
And
Yes.
yeah.
No, right. It's exactly right. So now I'm gonna pick on you a little bit because,
Okay.
and this is the great thing about the way that, like, that's why I do a podcast instead of try to do these things back and forth on the internet, because I
Yeah.
agreed I agreed with 92% of the words that you wrote in that sentence. There is there
Okay.
there is there is but there's like this one little spot. Now, so it's the awareness that makes them anxious. That's the part that I'm just going to push back against a little bit, because yes, you're right.
Okay.
They know more stuff about what's going on in the world, but that doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily make them more aware of what's really true. So here's what I mean by that. Are you
Okay.
familiar with a psychological concept called the availability heuristic?
Me probably, but explain it anyway.
Okay, so the availability heuristic is a term, kind of a psychobabble term for this idea that if I see a thing a lot, I put it in at the front of my head as being a bigger
Mhm.
issue than it actually is. So, for
Oh,
example,
yeah.
I
Yes.
might be super worried about car accidents that happen when people are texting or whatever, which of course is a real problem. But because I see
Hmm.
like a little flash up on my phone every single time it happens, then
Hmm.
I my worry about that as like a safety issue might
Hmm.
escalate all the way to like a psychosis, because
Right.
I keep seeing it on my phone all the time, and so it's actually causing anxiety. And where in our generation we might have been aware that you shouldn't call on your phone while you're driving, but we wouldn't probably be obsessed about it to the point where we're shaking while we drive or whatever. So
Right.
that's a kind of a weird example, but it's some of the anxiety and some of the general anxiousness of kids today, you're right, is related to technology, but I don't necessarily see that as a good thing. So there are some opportunities where, yes, you can be aware of social injustice, but you can also create a monster where there isn't necessarily one, and it's hard to tell by looking at your phone.
Right. Or to, yeah, because the way information is presented, and this is sort of what I meant by um what I meant by that's the part that's causing them anxiety, is exactly what you're describing, is that they see things blasted at them, and the phone's listening to them, so it hears them when they're talking, it sees what they're posting, and then it creates an algorithm to like bring that to their attention more,
Hmm.
right? And it ends up usually becoming a negative thing, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, the availability of that information, like I said before, is wider. They have a better sense of the things that are going on in the world, even if they don't have like you said, like they may not necessarily understand the truth of what's going on, because what they're seeing is out of proportion to reality.
Hmm.
But the fact that they even know that some things are a thing,
Is good.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, because and that again goes back to my diversity thing. I love One of the things I love about teaching at Mason is that we have a we sort of cater to a non-traditional student path.
Hmm.
And so we end up having, at least in our music ed program, we have a lot of licensure students who have degrees in music and come back to get their teacher license, and they take the regular classes with the undergraduates. And that diversity of age has, I think, been a massive asset, because the younger students, like for example, when I was teaching general music methods, we had a conversation about the problematic song list. It's basically like all the minstrel songs and the history,
Mm-hmm.
the problematic song list. And some of the people in the class who are around yours and my age were like, wait a minute, but what's wrong with that song? And like an undergrad in the back of the room is like, because it's this. But also the undergrads were learning from the life experience of the adult students. And again, that exists, we have that population in our school taking those licensure programs because they have the financial ability to do so.
Right.
Either because they have a spouse or they're just in a place in their life where they had enough money to pay the tuition or whatever, that we could equalize the playing field for some of the undergraduates if we had a program like Michigan's,
Mm-hmm.
especially in a place like Washington, D.C., where it costs a ridiculous amount to live.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and it sounds like from I haven't read the article or an article about the Michigan thing specifically, but it sounds from your description, it sounds like something that I would be on board for. I think I would draw the line at something like in the state of Kansas, starting next year, all student teachers, in order to be qualified, must receive a wage of X number of dollars, or you know, that kind of thing. And
no,
that's where I would say, I don't know if that's gonna not screw things up in the long run or make things worse in the long run, because I'd be worried that you'd pull people into those jobs for a job of student teaching that has a person who has no real intention of actually doing it for a career. And that kind of ties into this paragraph that I was highlighting, because in that paragraph about young people being whiners and that kind of thing compared to the previous generation, I think that is one of those cross generational lessons that we do need to teach the younger generation, which is there is actually value in struggle. Now,
mm-hmm,
it doesn't mean that you should struggle to the point of breaking yourself, but
right,
there is value in struggle, and if everything's handed to you, then you don't really know how to appreciate it. And so
right,
that's what I'm trying to protect here by
mm-hmm,
keeping the position or that line that I'm trying to keep.
absolutely. But I would say that student teaching is a struggle and a challenge for most people,
Hmm.
even without the extra financial strain.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know how your experience was, but that was true for me. um,
Right.
so and yeah, I agree that there is value to the struggle, and this is something I talk about with my undergraduates, that like when we're talking about the purpose of a long form lesson plan, are you ever going to actually use this in your classroom? No, I can guarantee you you're not. However, there is a purpose in making you do this work. And that is to help you learn how to process the information in the correct order so
Hmm.
that you can do it automatically later on. But if you don't go through that process, so I guess my argument would be is that there can be a balance. We can still give them things that challenge them in their student teaching placement without adding this extra financial struggle,
Hmm.
you know, because there are some things I certainly would have done differently or done better in my student teaching had I not had to go to work
Right.
afterward,
Right. Well, yeah, no, I
just because
exactly,
there'd
yeah,
be more time.
I agree. I agree. Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap up this part of the conversation and get us to
Sure.
the tail end of this by highlighting one more spot in your blog, which is the very last part, which
Okay.
is you kind of asking, so what is the point of a student teacher? Like, what is the point ultimately? What are we trying to accomplish? And you said, so is the internship meant to train people how to do the job well, or is it to train them how to accept the system, or how exploitative the system is, or as it is? Okay, so that this
Yeah.
in this kind of the way you framed that, my answer to that question would be the purpose is to teach them how to do the job well.
Sure.
That is the point. And so and as far as it being exploited, I have some difference. I wouldn't phrase it that way, because I think in a lot of cases when I don't feel exploited as an educator. I don't get paid as much as I'd like to, but I knew that at going in. They told me what I was going to get paid before I signed the contract. I agreed to it, right? So there's nobody trying to hold anything over my eyes. Now, I teach because I'm passionate about it.
Mhm.
I don't teach because of the benefits package or because of what it pays. I teach because I couldn't imagine myself doing something else. So I feel privileged to do what I do. Now, if I could snap my fingers, I would get paid more. But ultimately, I don't feel exploited. Now, so I want, when student teachers come in with to work with me, I'm also teaching them about that. I'm also teaching them that
Great.
a grateful teacher is a better teacher. A bitter teacher is a worse teacher, like in almost every case. If you
Absolutely.
if you listen to kids talk about the teachers in the building that they don't like, it's the ones that don't like their job and
Yeah.
complain about it all the time. So again, there's that balance I'm trying to keep
Yeah.
between those two concepts.
Right. So I think there's also a balance between loving your job and letting yourself, let me see if I can phrase this better. um, I, the best paying district I ever worked for was also the worst district I ever worked for.
Mm-hmm.
Just straight up was the principals were all in your business all the time, micromanaging everything, letting the students run things, not backing you up when the kids were in the wrong or the parents were in the wrong. But there were so many teachers who were willing to put up with that and willing to stay there because where else are they going to go? Anywhere else they went in the state was going to require a pay cut.
Yeah. Yep.
I was not willing to do that. And I ended up leaving to adjunct at a community college for a year after that. But which did not pay better,
Of
believe
course.
me.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
um, so there again, there's a balance because I'll be perfectly honest. The only reason that we are in a position for me to be in higher ed and to take the pay cut that came with that is because my husband's in the military.
Okay.
So he has another job.
Mm-hmm.
And that job allowed us access to signing bonuses and a VA loan and his GI Bill that paid for my doctorate and a whole host of other things, including saving our butts from being homeless when the financial crisis hit and we lost our first house.
Mm-hmm.
The military gave him a full-time job so that we didn't have to like move in with our parents with a
Right.
baby,
Yeah.
which I have massive problems with, again, systemic, the idea that in order to thrive as a teacher, as two teachers, two full-time teachers, that he has to have another job that allows us access to things that people should just have anyway,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
like cheap healthcare.
Yeah.
And so for me, putting this stipend or scholarship or whatever they want to call it, I don't have any issues with calling it a stipend or whatever, to help students get past that first obstacle, I think is only going to benefit the teacher pool in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Because you will get more people who come into the profession grateful
Yeah.
and happy to be there, happy to do the work, and not coming in feeling burnt out and bitter starting out, because
Already.
that's one of
Yeah.
the reasons. Yeah, because that's one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons we lose so many teachers in the first 5 years is they go, oh, you don't get into teaching for the money, but then they get into it and they see what that actually looks like. And they're like, but you want me to do what? And you
Right.
want me to do the same amount of work as this guy down the street who's getting paid twice as much as me? Nah. And they leave.
Right.
And I don't blame them.
Yeah. Now sometimes they
Right.
leave. Yeah. Sometimes they leave for that reason, and sometimes they leave because they just
Mhm.
don't like teaching. Or
Yeah.
it's not the dream that they thought it was. And in other words, sometimes
Right.
people go into teaching thinking that they're going to be, like Edward James Olmos from Stand and Deliver, and they're gonna
Yeah.
they're gonna change people's lives, and they're gonna have kids like running into their room crying because they love them so much, and when they
Yep.
realize that that's not how it is, you have to earn that, and it takes time.
Mhm.
And so there is that too, and so
Yeah.
and so I because
Yeah.
I agree. I think, and it also, like I said, with my situation, it depends on so many things about whether or not
Mhm.
you can handle it. So, for example, one of the things that we hear about a lot is teachers have to get multiple jobs in order to make ends meet. In my situation, I have 4 jobs, but I wouldn't have time to do all those jobs if I wasn't a teacher, right? Because I fill in now in my situation. I think musicians are a little bit at an advantage with this because one of my jobs can be a
Yeah.
church job, right? And I
Right.
can my church jobs are great pay for the amount of time that they work. Oftentimes, at least if you're in a city,
Absolutely.
If you're in a city, they are.
Yeah.
And so, I get to but I wouldn't have time for that if I didn't have the kind of reduced total work hours of a teacher. And
Hmm.
I think a completely different podcast though would be teachers who take their work home with them and work beyond contract hours and all that, which I don't. And so I have time to do the podcast, and I have time to do the church job, and I have time to do
Right.
the nonprofit that I run, and
Hmm.
all that kind of stuff. And so it's for me, I love the lower the lower contract time and the lower pay that comes with it of teaching, because I that means I have time to do those other things.
Should do other
And so again,
things.
it's
Right.
perspective. It's my perspective.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think it's important for student teachers to understand that,
Hmm.
but at the same time, just just bringing it back to the one sticking point of, like, do we want to give them this money to get through that? I don't necessarily think that that would be a bad thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that I think the problem with that, with giving that, like, I don't know if Michigan has a thing for this. This would maybe I'll write a letter to my friends who work in policy up there, that the mentor teachers should be also getting paid.
Oh yeah.
Maybe, they're already making a full salary, so they don't need like money to pay their rent or whatever. But like when I was in Florida doing my doctorate, while we were there, they passed a gigantic pay raise for first year teachers, for teachers entering in,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't proportionally raise the teacher salaries across the board. They only
Ah,
raised it for the beginning teachers. So with that move, they brought all the first year teachers up to here, and now the people with 20 years experience are going, hold up, what?
right.
Because, like you said, they're still learning the job,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
In the first few years. So why are they getting paid the same? So there's the other side of it, is that we need to be thinking about, if we're asking the mentor teachers to take on extra work, how are we compensating them if we're going to give the student teachers this extra resource?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
that's the other side of it. And I haven't read anything that Michigan's doing with that. I don't know. So we'll see. It's going
Yeah.
to be interesting to see how that works out
Yeah, no,
for
that'll be
them.
great, and I think this is going to be a really fun episode for people to chew on, and hopefully generate some conversations. And on the way out, definitely remind people that we'll put some resources from this conversation in there, and
Sure.
any of the links to articles, or the research. I think you mentioned like diversity research. Stuff that
Hmm.
you talked about, that'd be great to link in there, just to kind of give
Yeah.
people a chance to click around and educate themselves on this topic. But Tina, this has been really fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on to join me.
Thanks so much. Yeah, of course.
All right. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of the episode. Like I said, that was lively and fun. I really enjoyed talking to Tina about this. Even though I don't think we came to a full agreement, we did find some common ground, which is the kind of the middle ground of, what if it's not a job, but what if we figure out in each state a way to financially support the kids who can't live with their parents, who can't reasonably make ends meet while they're doing this, so that we don't burn them out, so that we don't turn them away from the profession because they know they're going to have to do this grueling semester. I'm okay with that. And I think she's okay with that. And I think that's the value of these types of conversations that start on two ends of the boxing ring. And in the middle, instead of punching each other, there's a hug. So I'm glad you stuck around and listened to that. If you are still listening, that means you got something out of this. And I would encourage you to head over to Patreon and become a subscriber if you're not already. The link is in the show notes, as well as using Coralosophy at checkout at all of the awesome vendors, ryanmain.com, mymusicfolders.com, Graphite Publishing, and Sight Reading Factory. Don't forget to like and share and leave comments. Interact as much as you can. That really helps people see the show that really need to see the show. Thanks, everybody.